The dish was still on the stump when I walked out that morning. It had been there since before first light, the way it always was, filled with whatever was ripe enough to pick or buy, a shallow ceramic bowl the colour of old cream that Marlene had used for 30 years before she started setting it outside. A few late-season huckleberries, a handful of rose hips I had gathered from the fence line 2 days before. I stood at the edge of the porch in my wool socks and looked at that bowl. And I thought about how I had not said her name out loud in 11 days, because I had been counting. To understand why that bowl on that stump on that particular morning stopped me the way it did, I need to go back about 3 weeks, to a Tuesday afternoon in late October when I pulled a box of old field notebooks off the shelf above the kitchen window and sat down to read through them for the first time since I retired. If you have ever spent a long time inside a discipline that required you to measure everything, to weigh evidence, to sit with what you observed before you committed to any interpretation of it, then you may understand what it felt like to watch that same training start to fail me in a stand of Douglas fir on a cold November dusk. I am not a man who accepts things he cannot account for. That matters. Remember that it matters. I had worked 31 years for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, most of them in the Ochoco foothills east of Prineville, counting mule deer, tracking elk migration corridors, writing habitat assessments nobody entirely agreed with. I retired at 62, which was earlier than I had planned and later than Marlene had needed. She had been sick for 4 years by the time I cleared my field equipment out of the agency truck and drove it back to the regional office. She died 16 months after that. The illness was slow, and then it was not. And the transition between those two speeds was the worst thing I have ever witnessed. And I am a man who spent 31 years cataloguing what happens to living things when the conditions around them change beyond what they can absorb. She died in April, 2 years before the autumn I am talking about. The house, which is a cedar-sided place on 14 acres in the foothills, about 12 miles north of Paulina, felt enormous after. Not just the rooms, the whole property. I had known every acre of it the way you know a piece of land you have walked daily for 23 years. And without her in it, all 14 acres turned into a kind of geography of absence. The garden she kept near the creek, the bench on the south side of the house where she read in summer, the cedar stump at the yard's edge, which had been there since before we bought the place, and which she had started using as a surface for that bowl of berries 8 or 9 years ago. She said she had read somewhere that leaving fruit out attracted birds. I told her, in the flat professional way that I understand now, was one of my less attractive qualities, that it more likely attracted rodents. She filled the bowl anyway, every morning, before she made coffee. After she died, I kept filling it. I could not have explained why at first. I want to be honest about that. It was not a decision I made in any organized way. It was more like how you keep reaching for a light switch in a room where the bulb burned out. Your hand goes there because it has always gone there, and the fact that nothing happens doesn't immediately change the motion. So I filled the bowl. Rose hips in early fall. Dried cranberries from the bag I kept in the pantry when nothing was fresh. Whatever was ripe on the property when something was. Pepper, my blue tick hound, would follow me to the stump each morning on her stiff old legs, sniff the base of it, and then turn back toward the porch and the warmth of the house. She was 12 years old, going grey around the muzzle, arthritic in her left rear hip in a way that made her careful on cold mornings. She had been Marlene's dog first, technically. The distinction had collapsed sometime during the illness, the way a lot of distinctions had. I had not spoken to my son Dale in 22 months. That is not a fact I put down lightly. He lived in Bend, 45 minutes south. We had not had a blowout, not one clean explosive argument that might have cleared something. What we had instead was a series of conversations that ended with him saying some version of the same thing, which was that I had been gone for most of his growing up, out in the field counting animals, and that when his mother got sick, I had not known how to be present in the way she needed, because I had spent so long training myself to observe from a professional distance. He was not entirely wrong. That was the part I found hardest to answer. The conversations got shorter, and then they stopped, and I had tried once in the spring and left a message on his machine that he did not return. And after that, I had not tried again. That was the shape of my life in the autumn I am telling you about. Retired. 14 acres. Pepper. The bowl on the stump. 31 years of field notebooks sitting in a box above the kitchen window that I had never once opened since I carried them home. On my last day at the regional office, I opened them on a Tuesday in late October because I had nothing else to do that felt like anything. The weather had closed in the way it does in the Ochoko foothills in October, grey and close and smelling of wet sage. And I had already split enough cordwood to last 2 winters, and I had already done every maintenance task on the property I could reasonably manufacture. I lifted the box down, set it on the kitchen table next to my coffee, and started reading. There were 17 notebooks. Some of them were mine, observations I had made on transect surveys and habitat evaluations going back to my early years with the agency. Some of them were older, inherited from a biologist named Walt Greaves, who had worked the same district before me and who had retired in 1979 and died of a stroke about 15 years after that. Walt was a careful observer and a laconic writer. His entries were terse and precise, and largely uninteresting to anyone who did not already care about elk range expansion in central Oregon in the 1970s. I had absorbed his notebooks gradually across my own career, cross-referencing his habitat notes against my own surveys, occasionally citing his population estimates in reports. I knew his handwriting the way you know the handwriting of someone whose work you have depended on. I came across the entry on the 3rd afternoon of reading. It was dated October 14th, 1973, and it was filed inside a notebook that covered the Ridgeback Creek drainage, which is about 4 miles from the house I live in now. Walt's handwriting was the same as always, compact and slightly backward slanting. The entry read, in its entirety, subject observed at 1710 hours near Lower Ridgeback, approximately 40 meters from creek bank. Bipedal. Estimated height 7 to 8 feet. Dark coat, heavy. Moved in a direct line south-southeast without apparent awareness of observer. Stride approximately 5 feet. No odor noted. Duration of observation approximately 90 seconds. Behavior. Subject paused mid-crossing, crouched at a low stone, appeared to examine or handle something at ground level, then continued. Not deer, not bear. Classification. Unknown. No entry will be made in the formal agency report. Note filed here for personal record only. I sat with that for a while. I read it 3 times. My first response, and I want to be clear that this was a trained professional response, was dismissal. Walt was a rigorous man, but he was also a man who worked alone in remote terrain for months at a time. And isolation does things to a person's perceptual calibration that are well documented. Low light at 1710 in October in the Ochoko foothills meant he had perhaps 20 minutes of reliable visibility. 7 to 8 feet was not a measurement, it was an estimate, and estimates made at 40 meters under tree cover are unreliable at the best of times. As for the crouching at a low stone, any number of animals would pause and appear to handle something. A raccoon, a black bear, even a large coyote seen at the wrong angle. I closed the notebook. I put it back in the box. I refilled the berry dish the next morning and thought about something else. The problem was that I kept not thinking about something else. I would be splitting kindling or warming soup on the stove, and Walt's notation would surface again, that flat professional language applied to something it had no business describing. What got to me was not the subject itself. What got to me was the phrasing Walt had chosen. Not deer, not bear. I had spent 31 years writing field notes, and I knew what it felt like to write those two words. It meant you had already worked through your categories and found them insufficient. Walt would not have written those two words unless he had genuinely tried everything else first. By Thursday, I was walking the lower end of the property at dusk. This was not unusual behavior. I walked the property every evening. It was one of the structures I had built after Marlene died, one of the ways I divided the day into pieces small enough to carry. Morning, coffee, berry dish, split whatever wood was needed. Afternoon, whatever maintenance had accumulated. Evening, the circuit of the fence line down to Ridgeback Creek and back up the west slope to the house. Pepper came with me when her hip allowed it and stayed home when it didn't. In late October, her hip was worse in the evenings, so she had been staying home more often than not. Thursday evening she came. She seemed to want to come. She was waiting at the door with that particular arrangement of ears and posture that I had learned over 12 years to read as a kind of insistence. I put on my canvas jacket and my rubber boots, and we went out together. The air was cold enough to see breath and smelled of pine duff and creek mud. Light was failing on the ridge to the west, the sky going from pale orange to a colour that did not have a simple name, and the firs at the bottom of the slope were already dark and merged into a single mass. I walked the fence line the way I always did, checking the wire by feel and habit, and I noticed after about 10 minutes that I had not heard a bird since we left the porch. This is not a dramatic thing to say in the way dramatic things get said. I am talking about a specific absence that anyone who spends regular time outdoors in that kind of country would register. The Ochoko foothills in late October carry a particular background sound even after dark. Nuthatches finishing their last circuits, a pair of Steller's jays that roosted in the firs downslope, and who complained about everything, the occasional rustle of a junco in the understory. That evening there was none of that. There was the creek, which was low and quiet this late in the season. There was the wind, which was not much. And there was nothing else. Pepper walked close to my left leg. She was not doing what she usually did, which was quarterback and forth across the ground ahead of me, nose working. She was walking straight, heel to my boot, and she was not sniffing. She was just moving with me in a way I had not seen from her in several years. I stopped at the creek bank and she stopped with me, and neither of us moved for about 2 minutes. It was not frightening. I want to be precise about that. Unease is not the right word either. It was more like the feeling of a room where someone has recently been, where the air still holds the fact of another presence, even though no one is visible. I stood at the creek bank and felt that, and I told myself it was the silence, which was real, and fatigue, which was also real, and the fact that I had been reading about something unsettling, and was therefore primed to interpret ambiguous stimuli in a particular direction. I told myself all of that. I believed some of it. We went back up the slope to the house, and I made soup and went to bed. Friday morning I found the impression. I would not have found it if I had not been walking with my eyes on the ground, which was itself slightly unusual. I was cutting across the soft ground near the creek bank where a small seep kept the soil wet through most of the season, and I looked down and saw it. A footprint in the soft earth. One footprint, nearly as long as my forearm, which I measured against it right there on my knees in the cold mud. 5 distinct toe impressions at the forward edge. No claw marks, which eliminated bear immediately. The stride, if I could infer a stride from the single track and the depression in the vegetation on either side of it, would have been somewhere around 4.5 to 5 feet. I sat back on my heels and looked at it for a while. Bear had been my first thought. Large black bear could produce a wide, flat-footed track, but the toe spread was wrong, and the length was wrong, and the absence of claw marks was definitive for anyone who had spent as much time as I had looking at bear sign. I considered the possibility of a misread, that I was looking at an overlapping set of smaller tracks that had merged in the soft soil. I looked at it for 5 more minutes. That was not what I was seeing. The second thing I noticed was about 6 feet away, on the flat top of a low boulder near the creek bank. A small cluster of huckleberries, 6 or 7 of them, arranged in a rough circle. Not crushed, not scattered the way an animal feeding would scatter them. Set there, each one distinct and upright. I am a man who spent 31 years with a baseline assumption that the natural world operates according to observable and repeatable principles. I applied that assumption to what I was looking at. I tried it the way you try a key in a lock that you're not sure fits. It did not open anything. I went back to the house and took Walt's notebook out of the box and read the entry again. That was a Friday. The encounter happened Sunday evening. I have told this story to almost no one. I told my neighbor Frank once, about a year after it happened, in the abbreviated way you tell something when you are not sure of your welcome. And he nodded with the specific politeness that means a person is filing what you said in a category and moving on. I understand that. I did the same thing with Walt's notebook for about 48 hours. The difference is that on Sunday evening, I no longer had the option. The sky that evening was clear after 2 days of cloud, and the light was the particular deep gold of a Pacific Northwest autumn, at about 5:15, low and slanting and precise, the kind of light that makes the texture of bark and stone visible in a way that ordinary light does not. I had put the berry dish out at the stump that morning as usual, rose hips and a few dried cranberries, and when I walked past it at midday, I had noticed it was empty. I told myself birds, possibly a deer, though deer generally didn't take berries cleanly from a bowl. I refilled it from the pantry bag and left it. Pepper had not moved from her spot in front of the wood stove all afternoon. When I put on my jacket at 4:45 for the evening walk, she got up without being invited. And this time, she did not limp at all on the left rear hip that had been troubling her all week. She walked to the door and waited with her ears up, and her tail low and slow. We went out into the gold light. The air smelled of pine pitch and cold ground, and the particular sweetness of the rose hips in the bowl on the stump. I walked toward the fence line and then I stopped. Something was standing at the stump. I want to be careful about this part because the training that I had for 31 years does not leave a person. And my first instinct, even at that moment, was to observe accurately and not to describe more than I could support. It was standing at the stump. It was between 8 and 9 feet tall, upright, on 2 legs, and its posture was not aggressive in any way I knew how to read. It was broad across the shoulders in the way that suggested genuine mass rather than fur alone, though the coat was heavy, dark brown deepening to black across the back, and in the low gold light of that particular October evening, it absorbed the colour the way old timber does. It was facing the stump. It had not turned toward me. Its arms hung at its sides, and they were long in a way that the low slant of light made very clear. Pepper stopped at my left knee and sat down. I did not move. I did not speak. I breathed through my nose in a slow, deliberate way because that was what my body found to do, and I stood there and watched. The creature reached toward the stump with one hand. The motion was slow, considered, the kind of motion that carries intention in it rather than habit. The fingers were visible in the light, very large, and they moved over the ceramic bowl with a kind of attention that I cannot describe more precisely than that without overstating what I actually saw. It lifted several of the dried cranberries from the bowl. It placed them again, separately, spacing them around the rim, one at a time. I need you to understand that I have been watching how wild animals interact with objects for 31 years. I know what incidental contact looks like. I know what feeding behavior looks like. What I was watching was not either of those things. What I was watching was deliberate placement. The same motion Marlene had made every morning for 8 or 9 years, setting berries out on that bowl with a patience that I had called impractical, and that I had been performing myself, imperfectly and without understanding why, for 2 full years since she died. The thing Marlene had always done with the last berries was to set one at the center of the bowl, a little separate from the rest. I had done it too for 2 years without really knowing why. I thought I was just imitating the habit without having its meaning. Watching from that distance in that light, I saw the creature place the last cranberry at the center of the bowl and then draw its hand back. It knew. That is not a scientific statement. I am not making a scientific claim. I am telling you what I observed, and I am telling you that my 31 years of professional training left me standing in a field in October with no vocabulary for what I was watching, because the vocabulary would have required me to describe an act of care, and the category of care did not at that moment belong to anything outside of what I had been taught to call human. The creature stood for another moment, its back still toward me, the cedar stump between us, the bowl of berries arranged the way Marlene had always arranged them. The light had shifted another degree toward gold, and the dark edge of the timber at the property's boundary was beginning to merge with shadow. Then it turned its head slightly to the right, not toward me, not away from me, just turned the way a person turns when they are aware of something behind them without wanting to make the awareness into a confrontation. In the low angle of the light, I saw the profile, the brow ridge, the set of the jaw, and then the eye, dark and large and catching the last of the October light in a way that registered in my chest before it registered in my mind. Pepper did not move. She sat at my left knee with her chin slightly elevated and her ears back in the particular arrangement that in 12 years I had only seen from her in the presence of something she trusted entirely. The creature moved then, not suddenly, not in alarm. It turned back to the fence line and walked into the timber in an unhurried straight line, and the brush closed behind it. And the sound it made doing this was considerably less than I would have made doing the same thing, which I noted in some portion of my mind, even as the rest of it was doing something else entirely. I stood where I was until the light failed. I am not certain how long that was. 20 minutes possibly. The cold came up from the ground and worked through my boot soles, and I did not move, and Pepper sat beside me, and I looked at the cedar stump with the bowl on it and the berries placed the way Marlene had always placed them, and I felt something I cannot and will not try to dress up into something else. It was grief, the ordinary kind, the kind that had been sitting in me like a stone for 2 years, except that it was moving. It was moving the way frozen ground moves in the first week of thaw, slowly and with some resistance, and in all directions at once. I had not cried since the day of the funeral. I want to be plain about that. I had not cried since the morning they lowered her into the ground in the Paulina cemetery. And that was because what happened after funerals, for men of my particular upbringing and generation, is that the structure returns, the practical demands of the day reassert themselves, and the grief goes somewhere interior where it functions more or less as a weight rather than a wound. For 2 years I had been carrying that weight. I am telling you that standing in a field in the dark, with a bowl of berries on a cedar stump, and a 12-year-old hound at my left knee, whatever had been holding it began to let go. I walked back to the house eventually. I do not remember deciding to. I just found myself on the porch steps with the door open and the warmth of the wood stove reaching out into the cold air. And I went inside, and I sat down in the kitchen chair that I used, and not the kitchen chair that had been Marlene's, and I stayed there for a while. Pepper climbed onto the old wool blanket in the corner by the stove and put her head on her paws, and watched me with the patient gravity that old dogs achieve when they have been around long enough to understand that some things require time and that their job in those moments is simply to stay. I thought about Walt. I thought about him sitting at a field desk somewhere, probably in a truck or a tent, writing that entry on October 14th, 1973, using language stripped of everything that couldn't be defended, and then writing at the end of it, "No entry will be made in the formal agency report. Note filed here for personal record only." I understood that choice in a way I would not have understood it 2 weeks before. There are things that the formal report cannot hold. The formal report is a real and necessary instrument, and there are still things it cannot hold. I went to bed. I slept in a way I had not slept in perhaps 2 years. Deeply and without waking, until Pepper's nails on the kitchen floor told me it was morning. I put coffee on. I stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and looked out at the stump, which was visible from that angle in the early grey light, and the bowl was empty. That was not unusual. Night had passed, and birds or small animals had likely taken what was there. I filled a clean bowl from the pantry. Rose hips, dried cranberries, a few dried blueberries I had not used yet. I carried it out to the stump, set it on the flat surface, and stood there for a moment in the cold. I went back inside. I poured my coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table. I picked up the phone and dialed Dale's number. It rang 4 times, and I was composing myself to leave a message, which was what I had done before and which had not worked, when he picked up. "Dad." His voice was careful, the way you are careful with a door you're not sure about. "Dale." I didn't have the start of a sentence ready. I had not planned past dialing, a long beat on both ends. "I should have called before now," I said. He didn't argue with that. He said, "Yeah." "I know there are things I did wrong," I said. "I know a list of them, and I know you have a longer list. I'm not calling to argue about the list. I'm calling because I don't want another winter to go by." He was quiet for long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call was still connected. Then he said, "How's Pepper doing?" It was not really a question about the dog. "She's okay," I said. "Her hip is better than it was." "Good," he said. We talked for 40 minutes, not about everything, not about all of it, about some of it, and about his kids who were 7 and 4 and whom I had not seen since the previous Christmas, and about whether he could bring them up sometime before the snow got serious. When I hung up the phone, I sat at the kitchen table for a while longer, and Pepper came over and put her grey muzzle on my knee, and I put my hand on her head. Over the next 6 weeks, I thought carefully about what to do with what I had seen. I am a biologist. I am a man whose professional identity was built on the principle that observations not documented are observations lost. I knew this. I also knew what Walt had known sitting in that truck or tent 50 years ago, which was that some observations are not the property of the formal report. What I arrived at after 6 weeks was something in between. I drove to the regional office in Prineville on a Tuesday in mid-December with the box of archived notebooks in the back of my truck. The woman at the front desk, a younger biologist named Reeves, who had taken on the district I used to cover, recognized me and waved me through to the archive room without much ceremony. I had called ahead and explained that I was returning field materials, which was true. I set the notebooks on the table in the archive room and sat down with the blank field notebook I had brought from the house, my own, a clean one, and I wrote a new entry. I dated it with the specific date in November. I noted the location as the property near Paulina, the time as approximately 17:15 hours, the light conditions as late direct sun at a low angle. I described the subject in Walt's register, which was the only register I had for it. Bipedal. Estimated height 8 to 9 feet. Dark coat, heavy. Duration of observation approximately 12 minutes. Behavior. Subject approached a ceramic bowl on a cedar stump and arranged dried fruit within the bowl in a deliberate, non-feeding pattern. Then I wrote, below the formal observation, Walt Greaves filed a note on this same drainage on October 14th, 1973. His observation and mine are consistent in all measurable dimensions. I believe he saw what I saw. I believe he made the right call about where to put it. I set the new entry in the back of Walt's 1973 notebook, folded and fastened. I returned the whole box to the archive shelf. I drove home. The winter that came after was a hard one in the physical sense. Snow coming early and the temperatures running below what they usually did. I split more cordwood than I had planned to, and I was glad of it. Pepper's hip eased some in the dry cold of January, which surprised me, and she started coming on the evening walks again most nights. Dale brought the kids up for a long weekend in February, and I made pancakes on Saturday morning. And the 7-year-old, whose name was Sam, ate 4 of them and told me they were good, which was the most direct compliment I had received in recent memory. I showed Sam the cedar stump and told him a version of the story, abbreviated and with the parts about his grandmother intact and the other parts left vague, and he listened with the complete seriousness that children of that age bring to things that seem important to the adults around them. I still fill the bowl every morning. It has a different weight now, the act of carrying it out to the stump. It is not the same motion I was making 2 years ago, which was the motion of a man running a habit because he could not bear to stop. It is something else, something that does not resolve cleanly into a word I have available. It is attentiveness, maybe, the belief, or something like belief, that the act is received. Pepper is slower now than she was, and she does not always make it down to the stump with me in the mornings. On the mornings she stays on the porch. I go alone, and I set the bowl down on the flat cedar surface, and I stand for a moment and look at the timber at the property's edge, where the firs begin and the light changes and the ground is soft enough, in all seasons, to hold an impression. I have not seen anything there since November. I have not expected to. That is not the thing I am watching for. I am watching the same way I have always watched, the way the work trained me, attentive and patient and willing to be wrong about what I think I know. What changed is the reason for the watching. For 31 years I watched because it was the job. For 2 years after Marlene died, I watched because it was the structure that kept the days from dissolving. Now I watch because something in the timber has been watching back, and it knew the shape of a kindness I had not been able to name. I don't have a word for what it was. I've been looking for one for a while now, working through the field vocabulary I spent 3 decades building, and every time I come close I find the same gap Walt found in 1973 when he put down his pen and wrote, "Not deer, not bear. Classification unknown." He was right. That is the most precise thing I know how to say. On quiet mornings when the light is low and the timber is still and Pepper is sitting at my left knee the way she sits when she knows something I don't, I set the bowl on the stump and I stand there in the cold and I think about how much of the world I spent 31 years cataloguing without understanding that the cataloguing was only the beginning. The bowl sits on the stump in the grey morning light. That is enough. It has always been enough. I just did not know until November that the knowing was mutual.